Wrong button. Wait a minute. Okay. Oh, what have I got here? Okay. So welcome everybody to today's webinar on behalf of the ASCILITE Learning Analytics Special Interest Group. We hold these webinars throughout the year, and this is our first one for 2018, so we're very excited to kick off with such an interesting topic. So we're going to be looking at learning analytics and learning design today, and our presenters come from the University of Auckland. We have Associate Professor Kathy Gunn and Dr. Claire Donald, who are going to talk to us about a very large project that they have been working on for the last however long, about learning analytics and learning design. But I'm sure they can introduce it better than I can, so I'll hand over to Kathy and Claire.
Thanks, Linda. We've actually lost the view of the presentation on the screen now. We have two.
Yeah, I have two. Yeah.
Did that happen when you turned the recording on?
Yeah, it happened when the recording started.
I think it might have been something I did. Let's see. Andre, are you able to change our view?
That's going to turn it on.
Open the session menu. No, that's not helping. What do we need to do? Switch to group mode. Yeah, no, we're not seeing the presentation, which isn't very helpful.
No.
Share content. I think Andre's left actually, which is unfortunate because he's the one who is.
Yes. Let me just see if I can. Not. I must admit I did. Press.
Okay, I think I've got it back.
Oh, here we go.
You'll see it.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I had to go in.
Great. It's not a proper webinar if there's not some kind of technical hitch.
It wouldn't be technology.
Great. All right, Kathy and Claire, take it away.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for giving your time to come along to this webinar. We're talking to you from sunny but very cold Auckland, New Zealand, and yeah, welcome all. We're going to talk to you today, hopefully for about 40 minutes, about our Learning Analytics research project, which has now finished, but ran for 3 years from 2014 till last year. There are parts of the project that are carrying on. You know, it's grown arms and legs that were never there in the original body, which is fantastic because when funding runs out, things sometimes grind to a halt. So what we're going to do is just give you a very quick rundown of what was involved in that project. Hopefully the slide that you can all see shows you who was in the project team, tells you that there were 3 New Zealand tertiary institutions involved, and it was funded by Ako Aotearoa, which is our National Centre for Tertiary Teaching Excellence. So yeah, let's go from there. We'll give you a quick rundown of the project, and then I'll hand over to Claire, who will talk about a framework developed for teacher professional development, which was one of the major aims of our project. And as we go through the project overview, I'll explain to you why we thought that was so important. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat window. We'll try and keep up with that while we're going through the presentation, but if not, we'll come back to questions at the end. So this was our project. Basically, we did a survey of tertiary staff because we wanted to get a sense of who our target audience was and what they understood about learning analytics. We developed 6 case studies which were emergent practice of using learning analytics in teaching and learning design. We ran user trials with 2 analytics applications. That was Context, which is a text analysis tool, and the Student Relationship Engagement System, which was developed out of University of Sydney and Macquarie, and quite a large collaborative project that's now continuing on a different version. We developed the framework, which we're going to talk about in detail today. which was designed to help teachers use learning analytics data. And we did a review of literature, which at the time was, more than 300 pieces of literature, and that number is growing all the time. And I guess we also contributed to that increase with a few of our own from the project. So that was what we did, and I just want to frame this part of the presentation with a comment about definitions and descriptions of what learning analytics is. And these two that you can see on the screen are quite common definitions. One is quite technical, one is more user-focused, but it's quite vague. So our sense after our initial scoping phase was that these definitions and descriptions are great for the research and development community, but they're not so helpful for teachers because they don't really tell teachers where to start and what to do with learning analytics. So although they're great for research, and this one that's on the screen now from a recent AGET article, we thought, well, yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if learning analytics actually did all those things easily and accessibly? But our question was, who are these definitions and descriptions for? Are they really speaking to teachers or not? And our sense was that they were not speaking to them very well. We did a paper on this topic in ASCILITE 2016. It was just a short paper. But it was talking about the missing link, which was the fact that there was fantastic research and development work going on in the learning analytics space, but very few of the projects that we read about were actually talking to teachers or aiming to do anything with teachers, to involve them in design or to think about professional development. And a number of them said that will come later. And our thought was, well, participatory design starts up front. So that was an obvious gap we found and chose to focus on as one of the many varied outputs of our project. So yeah, if teachers are the intended target users, they should be involved in the conversation from the start. That was our premise. So I'll start with a quick run through. We did a survey across 3 institutions. We didn't get a response that was representative, but we got a level of response that we thought was indicative. People who would relate to learning analytics enough to answer a survey. They were in roles, mainly it was teachers or people who had teaching in their role, but there were also researchers, professional staff and technical staff. We could break down the results of our survey based on those roles. We were looking at, what was their awareness, perceptions, understanding and experience of learning analytics, what were their frustrations and aspirations, and whether they were concerned or perhaps hampered by ethical questions. So just a very quick summary of some of our findings. There's full details of this survey and other aspects of the project in our project final report, which the link for is on the last slide. But a couple of representative things just to support the point about teacher professional development and engagement with teachers being really important. We asked a question about what perceived uses our respondents saw for learning analytics data. And so there's a number of different uses along there, students monitoring their progress, teachers monitoring progress, use of resources, identifying and supporting students, those kinds of things. So the responses that we got showed that some people were fairly aware. Well, somebody's asking which yellow is which on that graph. If you read the legend, aware of it, already use it, would like to use it, and no need for it, up in that ascending order, that corresponds to the images that you can see in the graph. Yes, that's right, aware is at the bottom, already use it is the next one up, would like to use it, and no need for it is at the top. So that gave us a bit of a sense of what people were thinking learning analytics might be useful for, or not, as the case may be. A question that sort of rang alarm bells for us a bit was, is it easy for you to access and interpret data? We found from our case studies as well as our survey results that no, it wasn't always easy to access and it wasn't always easy to interpret data. So we thought, okay, so attention is needed there. Data access has become easier since we started this project because learning management systems now generally have better facilities than they had then. But still, it's not always easy to access, and interpretation is a whole different question, of course. Is using learning analytics part of your role? This was only people who had teaching as part of their role. And, you know, some were not sure, some thought it wasn't, which was indicative of people's views that this was something that institutions did. It was more what we would call academic analytics, which is telling you about, you know, whole courses, comparisons over time, that kind of thing. So some people didn't see it was their role. Many saw ethical issues with the use of learning analytics. So this all basically told us that we were going to have to start somewhere really basic to get teachers on board and feeling that they could relate to what we were trying to do. Learning analytics was something that was actually useful to them. There's a few sample comments up on the screen now. One of these comments relates to access to data, not always easy, not well supported. And, you know, somebody's kind of fishing around with a self-taught approach, so they're not even sure if they're using the best approach. There was a lack of training in professional development. Well, that was no surprise. This was quite a new area, and this was something that we were aiming for. And to do that well, we also accepted that we needed to have you know, good access, good systems and good support and acceptable use guidelines in our institution before you can launch training and professional development, you know, that's actually going to be useful, it's going to hit the spot. And the usefulness of data, people are saying, well, you have to be careful because, you know, sometimes people jump to conclusions and assign causal effects where they're not actually well supported. So education was going to be needed. A few more comments about the value of numbers that is limited. Not necessarily all you need to have an insight. So you might need additional forms of data to back up or explain the numbers. And that last comment there was really insightful for us because it made us realize, not just that one comment, but that puts it in a nutshell, that researchers and the development community were actually talking about quite different things to what teachers understood, even with something as basic as how do you define data and what is learning analytics. So this comment is saying that, you know, basically students' work submitted for assignments and assessments, that is also data. That was not common understanding in the developer community at that time. So broader definitions. So that's a very quick fly through of some of what we got from the survey. I'm now going to give you an equally quick fly through of our case studies. We had 6 case studies. These were emergent use of learning analytics practice, partly to show what teachers were trying to do with learning analytics data, but also to identify the barriers and the kinds of support that they needed to be able to do that. Some of these case studies had quite significant struggles getting access to the data that they needed in the format that they can use, and you know, and making interpretation of it. So this really is just to show you that, you know, there was a wide variety within those case studies. There was postgraduate, undergraduate. One was a MOOC. They were using very different kinds of analytics tools. but they were all basically using student-generated data, which we call learning analytics, to give feedback to teachers for particular purposes. So a wide variety of cases that were already ongoing when our project began. So we didn't start all these, we just captured the experience, and sometimes we interviewed the case study leaders. Just to unpack one of those examples from the case studies, the SRES, the Student Relationship Engagement System, is something that some of you may have heard of. It has been quite a large collaborative project with a number of institutions involved in it. And the idea of this is just to connect staff with students, particularly in large classes. And that's not just those who are at risk, but you can look at data. You can connect that to student information systems data. And so you can get profiles of students and you can communicate with them in a personalized way. And you can do this at scale. So that's what the system did. What we had to do, some researchers have called this monitoring aware design. So it needs particular design features built into a course. Milestones at which you can check, have students accessed this resource? Have they attempted this quiz? Have they looked at past tests that have been put up for them? The second column from the left on that slide is showing you at what point this was monitored. And the right-hand column is what was being monitored. So there were a few things that had to be built into the course design to make that possible, but it was nothing too onerous, it was nothing difficult, it was nothing major, and teachers generally found it really useful to be able to get feedback like this during the course rather than just when students submitted assignments. So that was one of our case studies. The other ones are also explained in a separate report on the project website, which we will give you the link to. It's in the last slide of this presentation. But now to focus in on the professional development aspect of the project. We used the case studies and the interviews to develop common scenarios that most teachers would relate to easily, looking at ways to monitor student engagement, look at achievement, improve retention, and to give feedback that would inform course activity and design. We distilled these out of the data from earlier stages of the project and thought, okay, these are things that all teachers will be able to relate to, will be able to populate with their own particular course details, experience, and yeah, to work with this framework, which I'm going to hand over to Claire to explain, because she was the main author of this. It was just giving a familiar environment. The definition that I put up there, which I used in workshops, was just something that, you know, spoke more closely, more readily to teachers, I thought, about, well, what is this about? What outcomes am I going to achieve from this workshop? And then the workshop went through, how do you actually do that? So I'll pause for a minute there, and Claire and I will swap seats so she can be in the driving seat.
Thanks, Kathy. So, hi everybody, Claire Donald here. So we, great, thanks Vanessa. As Kathy said, we were trying to talk about learning analytics in our trial workshops in as familiar a way as possible, and based on all the survey data, the interview data, the case studies, and the people that we've been working with all along, we decided to try an approach where we talk about the kinds of learning analytics data that is available to teachers and learning designers in all contexts, whether you're teaching a fully online course, whether you're teaching face-to-face in a semester course, and all the blends in between, to talk about learning analytics and the three phases of the familiar rhythms of teaching, and to think about that in ways that we can come up with these actionable insights. So as you can see there in that diagram, that the first phase think of the first phase of teaching or of learning design being the preparation or the design and the development phase. What we did was we mapped all the kinds of data that could be available to teachers and to students during that phase of teaching. Same goes for the phase of teaching when we actually are teaching during a semester course or while a resource is being implemented, the kinds of data, learning analytics data that is again available to teachers or students during that phase, and then the data that would be available afterwards when we review and evaluate our courses and revise them and move back into preparation for the next cycle. So we in our workshops presented to our participants just a very a very brief tip of the iceberg sense of the examples of data that they would be using, which were of course familiar to them, and which are in a workshop handout that we've also provided a shareable link to in the chat window. So these are just to flick through the slides quickly, and then we'll move on to talking about how we actually ran the workshops. The admissions data, demographics, cohort size, course content are all the kinds of data that we were talking with teachers about. Course content there being one of those surprises, teachers and students, of course, and including this as the kinds of data one would be using in a learning analytics scenario. Data that would be available during the course would be the familiar things like student feedback, interim grades coming from formative assignments, activity data, heat maps, learning thresholds, how students are doing on anticipated misconceptions, and so on. And then the kind of data that would be available afterwards would be attendance records, pass rates. Learning thresholds, Sarah, is really, those are the anticipated tricky bits, what might be used in some disciplines might be called misconceptions, the kinds of predictable, difficult areas that students get stuck on. Okay, so if we categorize and start to think about the enormous range of data that's available to us as teachers and students during the teaching and learning process, that sort of sets the scene for the way we've trialed these workshops. Sort of, yes, Sarah, sort of threshold concepts and a bunch of other things that fits around that. So I'm going to just run through the workshop sort of run sheet with you very quickly on this slide here, just to show you how we ran it. We've trialed the workshops now several times and got quite a bit of feedback on ways that it can be used and be useful to teachers. The workshop handout steps people through a process where the first step is we invite them to think about a course that they teach where they have burning questions about something that's not quite right, something that they may wish, or that they may be wondering whether learning analytics could help them address a particular issue about how it's taught or about how their students are learning. So that's the first step, is the selection of a course. The second step is then that we invite them to list their questions or issues with this particular course in the handout. And then thirdly, to list the types of data that they have used or are using according to those 3 phases in the framework, data that's available to them about this particular issue, either before the course starts or the resource starts to be used, during the course and after the course is completed. And we find that at this stage, where they're starting to think about the kinds of data that are available to them, that we have to have fairly robust and conversations about what everybody's interpretation of data actually is, what can be measured and what can be used ethically. So if you're thinking about running a similar sort of workshop, allow a lot of time for the step 3. And then in the context of that, to list and write down what data is available for this particular course and when it's available. Conversations come up then about barriers to access and ethics and so on. So based on those first 3 steps, we then invite participants in the 4th step to select one of the questions or one of the issues that they identified in step 2, and to look at what data they have right now or what they can collect in the future to address those issues. And by this point, they will have mapped in the handout what kinds of data they have available at those 3 stages, those 3 chronological stages or phases of teaching. And then the 5th step of the workshop, we invite them to construct a brief scenario based on the question that they selected in step 4 to address, and that they structure. This is now a hypothetical scenario for them that they are thinking about enacting, where they would define the course and the problem statement. They would also include in that scenario what strategy they might use based on the use of using learning analytics before, during, and after the course is taught, what data sources they'd use, how they would evaluate that action and what insights they're aiming for, what the design and the teaching implications are, and what caveats they need to be aware of. And the point of building that scenario would then be that it would form the basis of an action plan for them at the conclusion of the workshop. So here is an example of, we give them 3 scenario examples in the handout, and so that they have something, an example to work towards. Yes, and definitely, as I said, step 3 of the workshop process was where those conversations happened, and some people started thinking about data in quite different ways. So here's an example of a scenario that's one of them in the handout that they can refer to when they're building their own scenarios. So this was actually one of our cases from our study, where the problem that was being targeted was that students were struggling with their transition to university, and there was a high dropout rate of first-year students. So what they wondered whether learning analytics could help them with in this very familiar scenario was whether they could monitor the presence of students better and the performance, so that they could target learner support better, because it was just too generic and not as individualized and responsive as it needed to. So the data sources that they could use in that scenario were data logs from the LMS, quiz and test scores that were constructed quite early in the course, new quizzes, and they set up a way of collecting student comments in a new way that they hadn't done before. In this particular case, it was a fairly large cohort, about 100 students. And ways that they then took action was to check the milestones, to trigger contact with students that were either not performing well or were students that were inactive, and used that to brief a group of student mentors that they had on that particular course. Yes, exactly, Vanessa. The pedagogical problem is the start. Absolutely. Yeah, so just running through the rest of that scenario, then the design implications for that would be that the milestone tasks have to be set up. This is the monitoring aware design that Kathy mentioned earlier. And of course, the caveat to be aware of is that presence or absence online might not necessarily indicate that students are at risk. They are maybe making choices for other reasons. So that's just one scenario that we used as an example for them. So that concludes my section of talking through the professional development strategy that we've come up with so far. We'd really welcome your comments. We're trialing this approach and this kind of workshop with different groups, and continuing to collect feedback on it. And so to finish up talking about the conclusion of our project, I'll hand back to Kathy.
Okay, thanks, Claire. And Vanessa, yes, I think your comment is absolutely spot on. That was something that we realised throughout the project was you can have data and it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but starting out with a question, a specific question that you want to answer, and then collecting the data that you need to be able to answer that question was a really important difference to how some people were perceiving the use of learning analytics, because you can look at data, it does not tell you anything, but if you have a question, then yeah, it's a much more focused and productive way to think about learning analytics. Hazel's question there about what happens after the workshops. When we first ran these workshops, we were doing a national roadshow, so we didn't have a lot of control about what happened after the workshops. What we tried to do was connect with local, teaching and learning support centres, IT people, administrators, and quite senior teaching and learning, PVCs or directors, people like that, so they could, take and use the workshop resources. They could collect the information that they needed, and they could address the issues that people were facing in their own institution. In our own institution, we had a bit more control, but we had to really work, and that work is still going on with the IT services and the planning office and the director of learning and teaching to get a policy in place that says data is accessible to teachers. They're using it for good purpose and for to support teaching and learning. And so it needs to be accessible, where previously it was kind of locked away and only drip fed to people who were felt to be authorised to handle it. So in our own institution, we wanted to get things set up well so the teachers could be supported after the event. So yeah, that was really up to the institutions that were hosting us to decide what happened after the workshops and to support ongoing communication with participants.
I'd just like to respond to Anne's comment that too often the question focuses on retention. Yes, we found that as soon as we asked staff and colleagues about learning analytics, there seemed to be this association that it was mainly being used by institutions to focus on student retention, which is why I'll just go back to the slide that we use, this one here, that we propose to use in our professional development is that it's that as teachers we can actually harness learning analytics for much more than that, and so yeah, we say that monitor student engagement. What we really mean is student activity. Student retention there, the third one, is only one of a much broader vision that we have for the use of learning analytics as teachers to really support our student learning.
If I can add to that, I think it's probably fair to say, certainly in this institution and many others that we became aware of, at institutional level, retention is something that is on the radar and that speaks to senior people and will get support. So, yeah, it's one of the many things, but it was one quite useful one to get the attention and get the support of the senior people, because if you can stop people dropping out. And also we had companies coming through here demonstrating products that would they claimed would save heaps of money and stop dropout, and you know, they were people selling technology based on hype, but they were getting the attention of those senior people. So it was quite one useful strategy to get learning analytics on the radar, but also to try and broaden understanding of what it was actually about at that senior level. Because teachers didn't need any help to understand that. But the pedagogy was a really important thing. Yeah. So yeah, the where to next, our project did finish about a year ago. And what our strategy in this institution is to provide support for teachers and learning designers' use of learning analytics, for more than just retention, you know, to monitor student progress, because that one lecturer described it as opening the black box. If you can monitor what students are doing during the course rather than just when they hand in their assignments, then you can do something about, you know, if there are problems, if there are challenges, you can address them as you go. Claire mentioned that in the handout, I think, as reflection in action as well as reflection on action. And so that's a process that we want to encourage and to provide support for. And that support includes, you know, data access protocols and tools that make it accessible, available, and easy to understand. We're also continuing user trials and development of tools, collaborating sometimes with institutions, mainly in Australia, but to some extent internationally, on development of tools. The On Task project, which is run out of Australia, is something that we are involved in, we as an institution. Yeah, so there's all sorts of ongoing, we're trying to infuse this through the culture of the institution, basically. And in my dreams, I would love to see learning analytics data taken account of in the evaluation of teaching process, rather than just giving students questionnaires about, you know, did you like this and was the teacher well prepared, but actually using data that's available to show, well, students are engaging. And I redesigned my course based on the feedback I got, you know, to this question, that kind of thing. So yes, Barnard, the top downers think they're improving retention. Yeah, I think there's trying to get that to meet in the middle as well, because bottom uppers are also interested in retention. They don't want to lose students, and if they do, they want to understand why and be able to do something about it. Yeah, it is fairly typical, isn't it? It is. Yeah. But when you can get the two working in tandem, it's great. So we now have a draft learning analytics policy in the institution. I think there are draft acceptable use guidelines. We implemented the Canvas learning management system from the beginning of 2016. Goodness, is it not long ago now already? And we're still working on, you know, kind of dashboards, data presentation tools, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's an ongoing. And why would anyone get cynical working in the learning technology field, Barnard? I fail to understand that one. So yeah, that's us really. So are there any more questions? Our final slide is just it's got the link to the full project report, which has a list of our publications, some of which may be interesting, and yeah, and a mugshot of us getting to the end of the project with the funding body and still managing to smile. So yeah.
Kathy had a question.
Yeah.
When you were working with academics and getting them to define their question or their kind of problem area and then define the data sources, were you coming across the issue of how they could then analyze that data? Because often it looked like from some of your scenarios in particular that data could be coming from multiple sources. Were there many tools available to staff to be able to analyze that data together?
Yes and no. Depending on, I'm thinking of one particular teacher in the population health context who was very, who had a long research tradition already of analysing health information data, and so she was quite independently she was independently, deciding what, transferring her research skills, shall I say, into the questions that she had about her course development and her students' use of them and how that impacted on their performance. And she was using her research assistants to do some of the data processing and the data wrangling that she just didn't want to have to learn about. And yes, but she knew exactly what she was after. There was such a range. There were others who were very dependent on professional staff in their departments to do the data processing and the reporting for them, and that was working very well. So yeah, a number of different responses to that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, no, it's just an interesting challenge that we've been facing in our institution is the fact that we don't have many learning analytics tools as such, but obviously data does get generated through the learning management system. So it's a matter of how do we enable academics to work with that data in ways that will be useful to them. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. I guess we can try and open up to the questions if people want to answer through audio, if they'd like to raise their hands, or else through the chat window, if there's any further questions for Kathy and Claire. It's all gone suspiciously quiet. Okay. So,
I think if I can just add to Claire's answer, though, to that question, Linda, getting combined sources of data presented in an accessible way, that was quite a difficult part, and that's still ongoing difficult. So
no, that's a good point. There was a question about ethical issues that just came up there from Vanessa.
Yeah, well, lots of ethical issues, and actually this project took off at a time when New Zealand was in outrage because the government had been discovered spying on people and selling data to America or some other major power. So it was quite a controversial topic at the time, which was both a good thing and a bad thing because it made raising the question of ethical issues really easy. It was very topical, but it also created a lot of suspicion with people. So, but having conversations about the ethical issues is useful. But Claire made a really good point, which she brought up in the workshop. Teachers have been using student data forever, to inform their teaching and their course design. So in actual fact, it's just a case of, doing what they've been doing forever, but with more data from more different sources. But breaking through that barrier of, the data guardians saying, no, you can't have access to this unless it's filtered through us and it's given to you in the ways that we want it. That's not been easy. But if you're doing it for the benefits of learners and learning and to inform teaching and learning design, there's not so many ethical issues around doing that. Although there are questions about, do students know that their data is being collected in this way? And I think these days the answer would have to be yes, they do.
Yeah, I think you made a very important point earlier about really that the policies and guidelines and procedures of the institution need to be developed in there when you're starting to have these conversations with staff, because I think that's a really key part of the puzzle of getting it all working together.
Yeah, I mean, we've have a number of questions coming to us now as learning designers and academic developers in our role. You know, academic staff asking about the ethical issues of using student activity data, and we're finding that most of their concerns are covered by the process that we have to go through for human ethics approval for for doing internal research, institutional research, shall I say, on our courses. We haven't had to, quite a lot of the things that teachers want to do with their data is already covered in that way. Of course, the crunch point comes when, well, do you want to publish? Or what are you going to do with the outcomes? If it is informing further course design and further teaching, then most of the time what they're doing is perfectly ethical and perfectly appropriate, and it's really nothing new. They're just using new sources of data. As long as it's aggregate and anonymized, and if it's not, then if it's being used as any teacher would use student performance data, then it's covered, in that context as well. So the question is new. Well, what are the new ethical issues? And there's heaps and heaps and heaps that's been written about that. That's a bigger question. Yeah.
We're going to move to Dan's question now about insights into the aggregation, use, or design based on qualitative data, particularly sentiment analysis. I may be a skeptic. I have no first-hand experience of this. I've read in the literature about some of the developments that are going on in that area, and it actually makes me very nervous, partly because, as one of our project team said in a conversation, she's somebody whose expressions tend to get misunderstood quite easily by human beings in conversation. So how is a computer kind of reading those sentiments going to get any kind of accurate reading? I find all that a little bit spooky, and I'm not sure that I see the purpose of it in education. But then, having said that, I'm aware that others do, and that there are some quite far-sighted and reasonably well developed things going on in the United States. I think, is it Ben Williamson, whose wonderful book, Big Data in Education, The Digital Future of Learning Policy and Practice, he's written on that subject. But yeah, the jury's still out on that one for me, and I'm quite ill-informed. So if anybody has any comments on that, I'd love to hear them. Oh, is Ben Williamson in the UK? Of course he is. He's at the University of Stirling. How could I mistake that for the United States? He's my neighbour. Thanks for that, Anne. Thanks for pointing that out. But Dan, did you have any experience or comments to make on that? I don't know if Dan's still there, is he? Okay, yeah. Likewise, watching this space. We have enough on our plates with the really practical uses of what we have now, rather than research into looking forward like that.
Yeah, I must admit that during the project and now thinking more and more about how the niche that learning designers and academic developers have. Well, there is most definitely a niche for the data, what shall we call them, wranglers and processors that are in the institution, but we're turning to work together and collaborate on these pedagogical questions, which is around learning analytics, which I think is the way forward. Does that make sense?
Any more questions or comments? Oh, there's a question there from Hazel about how some of these ideas translate to small cohort classes. Yeah, I think pretty much the same, but probably in small cohort classes, there's less need to monitor what's going on using data because you may be in a more close relationship with your students anyway. But you could use it in exactly the same way. There's no kind of guideline or difference between the number of students. It's just more of our lecturers here certainly have the problem of trying to communicate with large classes. So that's where the most pressing need is.
Yeah. And Hazel, it's an interesting question because, of course, I mean, as we know, we can't do the data processing, all the predictive analyses and the correlations with smaller data sets. But the same questions arise about student learning. So we just have to use different techniques.
Yeah, well, predictive analytics is another interesting one, isn't it? We had some member of the project team who was very skeptical about predictive analytics, and her skepticism was based on a really deep understanding of the algorithms and the kind of data processing techniques that were used in that. And yeah, predictive is, been shown by research to sometimes get it right and sometimes get it wrong. I'm always a bit nervous about leaving the computer to do all the work. I think there's a great place for human intelligence in that equation as well.
Thanks for all the comments and the support and the
so the question
is coming through.
How do I get my tutors to access to this data, and how do they decide how to use it? Well, I mean, hypothetically speaking, you talk to your administrators at your institution, tell them what you want, and they tell you how you can access that data. And then you take Claire's wonderful workshop handout and you run workshops with your tutors and yeah, encourage them to use it, and any barriers that they encounter, look at how you can address them.
I wouldn't say the dashboards are critical, but yes, the reporting and the efficient and valid reporting is really crucial. Sorry, I've just lost the top of the chat window.
Oh, how far up?
No.
Is that you have the mouse, you drive?
Yeah. Sorry, I've lost the question that I was linking up to Barney's and dashboards, but
so I think the conversation's moving on to sort of the usable visualizations and
yeah, I was going to say the good old LMS dashboards, quote unquote, or the analytics that we're getting from our learning management systems are a good place to start, especially if you're wanting to inform where to from here as teachers about what we need. Can anybody tell us about great work that's being done in that area?
I can tell you about my skepticism of work done in that area, in the sense that the one-size-fits-all dashboard, whether it's a student-facing or a staff-facing dashboard, does tend to lose the richness of learning design. And I guess that's what you're saying in your presentation today, is you've really got to harness the design and match the data to that design. And I think sometimes those generic dashboards don't really allow for that. However, I think there is scope for meaningful, useful visualizations and reporting, as you say. It may not necessarily always be in dashboard form, though, I guess would be my perspective on that. But I do know that there's a lot of research going on about dashboards at the moment.
Yeah, well, they're one useful piece of information or one useful tool, aren't they? And they're kind of simple and accessible, and just as long as you don't think they're telling you everything, they're probably quite useful.
They're a starting point, I would say. I mean, you know, so that the three most familiar ones. Thank you.
Thanks for the reference, Stuart.
Three most familiar ones from our project were at that time the dashboards that were being generated by LMSs, by the different MOOC platforms that people were teaching on, and by Google Analytics. And I think we've got we can do much better than that, but it's a start. Yes, and as you say, there's a huge amount of research being done. But it needs to include teachers.
Absolutely.
That's a good
Fantastic.
podcast as well about full access to data and knowing that you've got everything that there is, so you can make good judgments. Anyway, it seems we're out of time.
Yes, we're pretty close to the hour, so I think I would like to join everybody who's already been making these sorts of comments on the chat to say thank you very much, Kathy and Claire, for your presentation today. I've learnt a lot, and it looks like everyone else has too, and we've had such a wonderful and fruitful discussion at the end there, so thank you very much to you both.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. The appreciation is coming through thick and fast on the chat. Wonderful. So we'll stop there and we'll stop the recording. I guess if people want to continue chatting, they can. But for now, that's all from us. Just to say very quickly, though, that we will be having another webinar in the next month. Details of that will be made available very soon. I think we're meeting about it tomorrow afternoon to be able to send out to people through the usual channels. But again, a really interesting learning analytics topic for next month. So thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Kathy and Claire.
Thanks, Linda.